Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jason Nathu. I'm one of the council members on this year's Law Association of Trinidad and Tobago Council, and welcome to our continuing legal education seminar on migrants and refugees, the legal perspective. Now, we have a bit of a change to our program. Unfortunately, we've learned that the Honorable Minister is not able to attend this afternoon session. I know that may be a little bit disappointing for some of you all, but I'm hoping that we will still be able to have a very fruitful discussion on the topic this afternoon. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce the members of our panel who are here. We have with us Mr. Andrew Welsh. Andrew is a senior protection assistant with the UNHCR's Trinidad and Tobago office, where his work includes community-based protection and capacity building government authorities. Prior to joining UNHCR, Andrew worked with refugees in both the United Kingdom and in Ecuador. From 2016 to 2017, he was a legal and program officer at UNHCR's implementing partner in Port of Spain, where his work covered reception, registration, case management, and legal representation. He has written on regional human rights and refugee management and his writing includes an article for Oxford University's Forced Migration Review. Andrew holds a Bachelor of Laws from the University of the West Indies and a Master of Law in International Law from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. He is a certified associate in project management and speaks English and Spanish. We're also very happy to have with us this evening Yaclis Del Jesus Carrion Miano. Now, Yaclis is a Venezuelan lawyer and refugee. She has received her legal qualifications from the University of Margarita in 2016. Prior to this, she worked in the banking and public sector. Like many lawyers in Trinidad and Tobago, through her legal practice, she obtained experience in civil and criminal law. In 2003, she was the acting head of the passport issuance for the National Identification and Foreigners Office of the city of Portamar. In 2004, she carried out a registration exercise very similar to what we have just completed in Trinidad and Tobago with the government of Trinidad and Tobago's Venezuelan registration process, through which foreigners were documented. At this institution, she rose to the position of General Secretary and Assistant Director, and she was responsible for the operation and logistics of the registrars of notaries in the state of Nueva Esparta. But now the tables have been turned. Yaclis is the mother of 3 children, but she had to leave her country due to the difficult situation there. And she is recognized as both a refugee and a refugee lawyer in Trinidad and Tobago. So welcome, Yaclis. We will also have later joining us the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Professor Rosemary Bell-Antoine, and I'll make her introduction later on. So before we begin, we need to understand why we're having this seminar. And the association thought it fit to hold an exercise like this in our continuing legal education efforts to inform our membership on the current situation as it relates to migrants and refugees in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm sure we all understand that there is no legislation currently in place in our country. The state has just embarked on a very novel exercise, which is the documentation and registration of migrants. And of course, that is very much untested. There's a lot of uncertainty on how this is going to work going forward. Of course, the influx of migrants and refugees into this country presents novel opportunities and challenges for attorneys at law. And it's important that members of the profession understand some aspects of the law as it relates to migration, refugees, asylum, etc., and how the influx of migrants and refugees into the society will impact on our other structures, family law, civil law, criminal law, etc. So we thought it was very important to have this session as an introduction to where we go forward and to gauge what may influence government policy as a result of that. So as we begin, I'm going to invite Andrew to make his presentation on the present legislative arrangements and possible options for reform in Trinidad and Tobago. I know that we have a number of persons tuning in as well on the webinar in addition to the physical attendance here this afternoon.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody here and joining us by webinar. As Jason said, my name is Andrew Welch, and I'm a Senior Protection Assistant at UNHCR's office here in Trinidad and Tobago. And I will be giving you a presentation on the present legislative arrangements and possible options for reform. And I thought it was best to first, thank the Law Association for inviting me to participate, as well as Yakrelis, a Venezuelan refugee. But also to start with an anecdote in my first experience working with a refugee. And that was actually when I was at UE here in St. Augustine. I met a former Pakistani refugee that had fled Pakistan many years ago and claimed refugee status in the United States and came to Trinidad and Tobago to visit. And it was through meeting her, I learned about the challenges that asylum seekers and refugees face around the world. And that drove me to want to work with them to better their situation. And before I get into the substantive presentation, I wanted to set out definitions on who is an asylum seeker, refugee, and migrant. Because it's important that we set these definitions first, especially as we enter into this discussion. The terms we hear quite regularly in the media. An asylum seeker is somebody who says they have a fear of persecution in their home country. And that claim to persecution may be registered with an institution in Trinidad and Tobago, that's UNHCR, in the absence of legislation giving the government the mechanism to register asylum seekers, or their claim may not yet be registered, but they have this claim to face persecution in their home country. The main right of an asylum seeker is non-refoulement, and that is the right not to be sent back to a country where their life or freedom is at risk. A refugee started the process as an asylum seeker, but upon going through that process and having an individual interview to determine if they are a refugee, has been said to meet the definition of a refugee in the 1951 Refugee Convention. And that definition says that a refugee is somebody who has a well-founded fear of persecution based on their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group, is outside their country of nationality or habitual residence, and the state is unable or unwilling to protect them. So, in other words, you start the process as an asylum seeker, and you have an individual interview, and you're determined to be a refugee based on that interview. The main right of a refugee is, again, similar to an asylum seeker, non-refoulement, the right not to be sent back to a place where their life or freedom is at risk. And that crystallizes upon being determined as a refugee, because it's proven that they have this fear of persecution. That right applies to asylum seekers because they have the right to go through this status determination procedure. And to send somebody back before that procedure is completed is against due process, as we would all recognize as attorneys. A migrant is somebody who leaves their home for reasons unrelated to the refugee definition. So they leave their home because they didn't face persecution. For example, you could have left your home as an economic migrant, joining family in another country. However, you can't leave your home as a migrant and then apply for refugee protection. For example, many of us are Trinbagonians joining us online or here in the room, and we would know that there have been different waves of Syrian migration over the decades to Trinidad. And many of those Syrian nationals came to Trinidad seeking better economic opportunity before the civil war started in Syria, and they would have left as migrants. However, due to the change in country conditions in Syria, many applied for refugee protection and received it. So you could leave your country as a migrant, and because of a change in country conditions, be recognized as a refugee. In Trinidad and Tobago, UNHCR is here, first of all, to support the government. And we do that in different ways. We have trainings with government authorities, and regular meetings with the Ministry of National Security, which is our biggest stakeholder. In Trinidad and Tobago, we only work with asylum seekers and refugees, and they are what we call our population of concern. Trinidad and Tobago signed the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees in the year 2000, and that convention sets out the conventional definition of a refugee, but it also gives and sets out rights of refugees and obligations of the state. The main right, again, of a refugee is non-refoulement. Other rights in the convention include non-penalization for legal entry and presence, which we advocate for states to apply. For example, if you situate yourself in the condition of an asylum seeker, somebody who has fled their home for whatever reason of persecution, you mightn't have time to apply for a passport, go home for a passport, be in a part of the country that issues passports or visas, and you don't care, you need to flee for your life. So we ask states not to penalize asylum seekers and refugees for entering irregularly, and that's part of the Refugee Convention. Magistrates have, in some way, recognized this right of non-penalization. Even though it's not incorporated into our law, magistrates, using their discretion, have been issuing reprimands and discharges to many Venezuelans who, in their discretion, should not be penalized for irregular entry or irregular presence. Other rights in the convention include the right to social services, including healthcare, and UNHCR welcomes the position of the government in extending, although it's not a new position, primary healthcare to foreign nationals, including Venezuelans. And the government has gone further in that it is affording Venezuelans and asylum seekers and refugees the opportunity to receive antiretroviral medication to treat HIV. There is no domestic law incorporating the Refugee Convention and setting out a procedure. However, we are here to support the government. We've worked with National Security, one of our partners here, Living Water Community, and the Attorney General's office to draft a refugee bill to incorporate the convention into domestic law and to set out a domestic procedure for the state to determine who is a refugee. However, there are different avenues in which it can be said that Trinidad and Tobago still has to abide by its obligations at an international level. For example, when there's ambiguity in legislation, that the court should read the country's obligations into any ambiguous legislation. And that was said in Boyce against the Queen in 2004, and in the CCJ case of Maurice Thomason against Belize and Trinidad and Tobago in 2016. Courts have also said that international obligations could also be read into due process obligations in Thomas against Batiste from the Privy Council in 1999, as well as using legitimate expectations in the Attorney General against Boyce and Joseph from the CCJ. Zooming in into the domestic legal framework as it exists right now, the prime law of the land, as we all know, is the Constitution. And it can be said that the right of non-refoulement could be read into our Constitution, notwithstanding that we haven't ratified it as yet, the 1951 Convention. Our Constitution has the right to life, and could easily be said and argued that the state has an obligation to guarantee a refugee and asylum seeker's right to life and not send them back to a country where their life or freedom is at risk. We also have the Immigration Act, which is the main act that applies to asylum seekers and refugees in the absence of any legislation expressly governing them. As for nationals, it would obviously apply to them. What happens because of the operation of the Immigration Act is as follows. Many of us would have traveled to a foreign country, and when you travel, you submit your passport to an immigration officer, and you get a stamp. That stamp gives you legal time to be in the country. However, The nature of claiming asylum is that you're not going to go back home and you're likely to remain in the country where you're claiming asylum. According to interpretation of the Immigration Act, if you overstay, you don't have a legal status to change, meaning that if an employer wants to apply for a work permit for you, they cannot do that. If you have a child to go to school, your child cannot get a student permit because your child has overstayed. And we have approximately 1,000 school-aged children registered with UNHCR that aren't receiving any formal education. We also, well, refugees and asylum seekers are also unable to apply for permanent residency. And that's because of the current operation of the Immigration Act. The Chief Immigration Officer has, in the past, creatively used the Immigration Act to the benefit of asylum seekers and refugees, and we thank her for that and look forward to continuing our work with the government of Trinidad and Tobago. In fact, just after coming to this presentation, I was at a meeting with a dedicated unit in the Immigration Division called the Refugee Unit that handles all procedural matters for refugees. And if you as an attorney interact with a refugee for any reason, such as detention or any other immigration-related matter, please get in contact with the Refugee Unit in case you need any information, immigration information verified. They're located at the Richmond Street office of the Immigration Division. We also have the refugee policy that was created in 2014 with inputs from UNHCR, the government, and UNHCR's partner, Living Water Community. It incorporates many of the rights set out in the 1951 Convention, but is mainly a policy document that sets out the procedure for the government taking over refugee status determination, which is what UNHCR, which is some of the work UNHCR does right now here in Trinidad and Tobago. Again, on the domestic legal framework, and what occurred just 2 months ago was the government's registration exercise. And I would encourage you to speak to any Ministry of National Security official who will be better placed to talk about the registration exercise. But what I would like to point out to you as lawyers and direct you to are two pieces of regulation. There are two legal notices that the government created to give effect to the government's registration exercise. That's Legal Notice 109 of 2019 and Legal Notice 110 of 2019 that give the minister the authority to conduct the registration exercise, including setting out the form, but also implement the work permit exemption, which is the main right that Venezuelans will receive under the registration exercise, the right to work. And according to that legal notice, Venezuelans who registered with the government during that time period and who have a permit and that permit has yet to be issued by the Ministry of National Security are exempt from work. However, there are two requirements: to have registered and have the permits, and the permit has yet to be issued. The exemption only lasts from the end of May to the end of May 2019 to the end of July 2020. So time has already started to run. Now, why we also wanted to move on, why we also wanted and thank the Law Association for inviting us to be part of this presentation is to talk about why Venezuelans are leaving Venezuela. As part of my work in community-based protection, I have regular trainings with police officials in cooperation with the police academy and also immigration officials, as well as interface with Trinidadians and Tobagonians. And in my perception, you could change hearts and minds simply by providing information. And for your benefit, as you would have read in the news, perhaps, Venezuelans are leaving Venezuela because of a breakdown of social order. But what I would actually like to talk about and mention is the challenges that they face here. Yes, UNHCR has said that most Venezuelans leaving Venezuela will be recognized as refugees, but also they face many challenges. in transit to Trinidad and Tobago. Many of them may be trafficked. And here in Trinidad and Tobago, they face challenges with their legal status. The government conducted a registration exercise, but some Venezuelans might not have registered. And recognizing the situation in Venezuela, many Venezuelans might continue to come to Trinidad and Tobago outside of that registration period. Venezuelans and also other refugees and asylum seekers face challenges in labor and sexual exploitation, where they are paid sometimes 2/3 less than a Trinidadian, fair in reporting incidences of crime to the police, and through one of our partners, we're able to assist refugees make police reports. Other challenges that they face are xenophobia and access to shelter. On the work UNHCR does here in Trinidad and Tobago, I like to say that we don't only work with Venezuelans. We have refugees from over 30 different countries. Venezuela is our biggest caseload, but we have refugees from other CARICOM countries, such as Jamaica, from countries far away as Bangladesh and Syria, Nigeria. We really do have a diverse caseload with persons with differing needs. And through work with partners, we help to make their lives better here in Trinidad and Tobago, but ultimately it's in the state's discretion when it wants to implement a refugee law that we have helped them draft. We have regular meetings with the Ministry of National Security. We meet at a stakeholder level with the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of National Security, the Chief Immigration Officer, and other partners. We meet at a case management level with the refugee units and living water community. We conduct registration for asylum seekers who want to enter into the process. And we conduct refugee status determination, like I said. Every time somebody is registered with UNHCR or when they're determined to be a refugee or not, going through the individualized procedure, the Ministry of National Security is aware of who is here and who is registered and determined. We provide the Ministry of National Security, the Attorney General's Office, and the Chief Immigration Officer with a list of everybody who's registered and determined to be a refugee. We also conduct capacity building. Last year, we conducted a training in cooperation with the judiciary to train judges and magistrates on refugee protection. Like I said, we trained police officers. We held a training last year for attorneys, and we welcome further collaboration with the Law Association. Now, some suggestions when working with refugees and asylum seekers to you as attorneys, I would say if you need information from us as UNHCR, we respect persons' confidentiality, yet we recognize the good work you do as attorneys in representing asylum seekers and refugees. In disclosing information to you, we would need a consent to release personal information. So if you're ever representing a refugee before court and you need confirmation from us that the person is registered or to share their documentation, we will work with you, and please feel free to contact us. But if you need any personal information, we need a consent to share personal information from the refugee. Also, please feel free to contact UNHCR if you are working with a detained asylum seeker in IDC or an asylum seeker or refugee in prison. We take detention very seriously, and our procedure when notified if there's an asylum seeker or refugee in detention is to notify the refugee unit of the immigration division, who has their own internal mechanism for filtering that information down to the relevant immigration units so they could be informed and do their necessary work. If you ever need any additional information on any rights or policies, advocacy points when making arguments, please feel free to contact UNHCR here in Trinidad and Tobago. There's also a great website resource. It's called RefWorld, REFWORLD. It has a number of UNHCR policies, UNHCR guidance notes, but as well as cases on certain issues from various jurisdictions, such as United States, Russia, Canada, from the European Court of Human Rights, and other Supreme Courts. That's it for my presentation. I'd like to thank the Law Association for inviting me here today to present on behalf of the UNHCR, and I look forward to hearing the other presenters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I'm sure that many of us in our audience here today, both physically and online, will be contacting the UNHCR because representation of the refugee and migrant population is something that we certainly are seeing a large demand for. At this point, I would like to welcome to the head table Professor Rosemary Bell-Antwine, and Professor Antwine will be speaking a little later on. I also want to recognize Ms. Rochelle Naked, who is the coordinator of the Living Water Communities Ministry for Migrants and Refugees in attendance this afternoon. Thank you for being here, Rochelle. Okay, so our next speaker is Yaclis Del Jesus Carrion Mianu. Yaclis is a Venezuelan citizen, and she is going to be speaking on the options for migrants and refugees. Yaclis is going to be assisted by Daniela this afternoon, who will be providing translation for us.
Claro. Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon.
Listo.
Can you hear?
Gracias doy al arquitecto del universo por permitirnos esta excepcional convivencia, donde la confraternidad, el entusiasmo y la unión conforman un tripoide perfecto y contagioso.
I give thanks to the great architect of the universe for allowing us to take part in this exceptional encounter where fraternity, enthusiasm, and unity form a perfect and contagious tripod.
De igual manera, me permito reconocer el mérito de esta ilustre asociación de abogados en Trinidad y Tobago.
I would also like to acknowledge the merits of the Law Association of Trinidad and Tobago, this illustrious association.
A la decano de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de las Indias, la señora Anthony.
I would like to recognize the president of the association, Mr. Douglas Mendes, as well as the dean of the Faculty of Law of the University of the West Indies, Mrs. Antoine.
Al señor Well de ACNUR y a los demás miembros de la Asociación de Abogados de Trinidad y Tobago.
I would also like to recognize the presence of Mr. Welsh from UNHCR and, of course, the members of the Law Association.
En especial quiero dar gracias por la iniciativa que tendrán al incluir el idioma español dentro de su institución como parte de inclusión.
I'd also like to acknowledge today's initiative of including the Spanish language within the institution as a means of inclusion.
Ahora bien, como parte de su cuerpo, aunque en franco ejercicio democrático que alimenta las bases sin preferencias políticas, religiosas o sociales,
and now, as part of the body of this organization that nourishes the foundations of democracy without any political, religious, or social preferences,
tengan la plena seguridad que este espacio que hoy me ceden será aprovechado para el disfrute no de un momento de gloria, sino para la siembra de un mensaje de paz, fuerza y unión.
please rest assured that this space that is being granted to me today will be fully utilized, not for the enjoyment of a brief moment of glory, but to sow a message of peace, strength, and unity.
Apreciados y estimados amigos, con quien comparto el honor de ser abogado, así como la altísima responsabilidad de llevar en nuestras frentes la insignia impronta de nuestra alma mater.
My dear and esteemed friends, with whom I share the honor of being an attorney, as well as the colossal responsibility of carrying across our chests the celebrated insignia of our alma mater.
Ello me hace evocar el preámbulo constitucional que se establece en mi país, que es el considerado doctrinalmente como la base ideológica de las causas del texto de nuestra Constitución.
This brings to mind the preamble of the Constitution of my country, which is considered a doctrine that establishes the ideological basis of our Constitution. It sets out basic tenets, principles, and values.
En él se expresan las causas del texto, así como los principios y los valores básicos de la sociedad. Es necesario destacar que la doctrina que sirvió de fundamento a esta parte del texto constitucional
And these are the values of our society. It should be noted that the doctrine that served as the basis of this portion of the text of the Constitution
fue la del contrato social de Jean-Jacques Rousseau, quien expresa no los postulados de un sistema político, sino los anhelos, reivindicaciones y aspiraciones que proyecta en esa palabra un pueblo.
And the portion of the text of the Constitution that I mentioned was based on Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract. It describes not the postulates of a political system, but rather.
Ahora bien, cuando observamos la intolerancia por el pensamiento ajeno, la persecución a quienes disienten de un sistema democrático, cuando la tierra patria se mancha de la roja sangre de sus hijos,
but rather the longings, hopes, demands, and aspirations that the people of a nation have projected onto that term. When we perceive intolerance against the thoughts of others, when we see persecution of dissenters within a democratic system, when the motherland is stained red with the blood of her children,
cuando la distribución de la riqueza pierde el fiel de la balanza y cada día nacen más hijos de la calle,
when the distribution of wealth is unbalanced and every day more children are consigned to the streets.
Cuando tenemos temor de saludar al prójimo porque éste no promulga con el mismo ideal político,
when we become fearful of greeting our neighbors because they may not hold the same political ideals,
cuando podemos actuar con la libertad de pensamiento y solo podemos actuar bajo el yugo amenazante de un jefe o un patrón,
when we lose our freedom of thought and can only act under the menacing yoke of a boss or a master,
cuando nos cuesta decidir siendo jueces y cuando nos cuesta ver la inocencia en un imputado,
and when it becomes difficult to decide to continue being judges, and when it's difficult to see the innocence of the accused,
concluimos que estamos frente a un espejo roto y contaminado, y no frente al pulcro reflejo de la norma que fue procreada con anhelo e ideal de un pueblo.
then we conclude that we stand before the broken, polluted mirror, before the image of a broken and polluted mirror, and not before the clear, faultless reflection of the standards that were birthed as the embodiment of the hopes and ideals of a people.
Venezuela a lo largo de su historia se ha identificado por ser el país que más ha acogido migrantes a lo largo de su historia, especialmente durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial.
Throughout its history, Venezuela has prided itself as a country that has welcomed the most migrants, especially during World War II.
Todo esto por el auge que representaba la bonanza del petróleo. Estas personas ingresaban en busca de un bienestar económico, llegaban como migrantes y no eran rechazados.
In large part, this was because of the ascendance of the oil bonanza, and so people came in search of economic well-being.
Durante el siglo XIX y bajo la denominada fiebre del oro, los trinitarios ingresaron a Venezuela. Se centraron específicamente en el estado Bolívar, donde hoy día aún se siente su presencia.
They came as migrants and were not rejected. During the 19th century, during the so-called gold rush, Trinidadians came to Venezuela, specifically gathering in Bolivar State, where even today their presence is still deeply felt.
Podemos ver que sus gentilicios se expresa con culturas musicales como el calipso, con vocablos en inglés, así como la práctica del idioma patuá, entre otras costumbres.
Their cultural imprint can still be observed in calypso as a musical tradition, many borrowed English words and the patois language, as well as many other customs.
Muchos trinitarios llegaron a Venezuela a fomentar un gran aporte, ya que en muchos casos sus conocimientos en el idioma les permitía ser instructores de la lengua en escuelas e instituciones.
Many Trinidadians made significant contributions to the community, since in numerous places their command of the English language allowed them to teach it in schools and institutions through many years.
A lo largo de estos años, y me permito hablar específicamente de Trinidad, Venezuela fue un país que los acogió, los recibió y les permitió no solo crecimiento económico, sino también significativamente un crecimiento y desarrollo personal.
Over the years, and I want to talk here specifically about Trinidad, but over the years, Venezuela was a country that welcomed you and allowed not only economic growth and well-being, but also a great deal of personal growth and development for those who came.
Hago mención a esto ya que considero que debemos tomar conciencia para crear sistemas o mecanismos que nos conlleven a la convivencia e inclusión desde el punto de vista recíproco y solidario.
I mention this because I believe it's something we must be aware of in order to create systems or mechanisms that foster peaceful coexistence and inclusion on the basis of reciprocity and solidarity.
Con la finalidad de que se manifieste una sana convivencia. Aunado a esto, crear mecanismos de control que permitan revisar y vincular acuerdos para crear normas en las que se pueda regir y garantizar la aplicación de las garantías de protección.
Aimed at a healthy coexistence and complemented by the creation of a control mechanism that allows the review and linking of agreements that establish norms and standards to guide the application of the protection guarantees contained in the 1951 Convention.
Garantías que se establecen en la Convención de 1951, recordando que hoy día es el único tratado internacional reconocido para legitimar el régimen de la protección a los refugiados.
And let's remember that the 1951 Convention to date remains the only recognized international treaty that legitimizes the refugee protection regime.
Actualmente se estima que más de 4 millones de venezolanos han migrado a todo el mundo a razón de la crisis política que atraviesa este país, representando esto un gran reto para la ACNUR, por ser este el organismo encargado de velar por la protección de los refugiados que se han visto obligados a abandonar su país debido a la situación política.
Currently, it is estimated that more than 4 million Venezuelans have migrated all across the world because of the political crisis that this country is currently facing. And this is a key challenge for the UNHCR, being the entity that is in charge of protecting refugees that have been forced to flee their country because of a political situation.
Cabe destacar que el 31 de mayo, el Ejecutivo de Trinidad y Tobago inició un proceso de registro para los ciudadanos venezolanos, con la finalidad de otorgarles permisos de permanencia durante el periodo de un año. Asimismo, con este registro se le concedería el permiso para trabajar y ser protegidos por las leyes locales, a fin de regularizar sus derechos laborales.
It must be highlighted that on 31st May, the executive in Trinidad and Tobago initiated a process to register Venezuelan citizens with the aim of giving them permission to remain in this country for a period of 1 year. And with this registration exercise, they were given permission to work and to receive protections of local laws in order to regularize their status as workers.
En este proceso se pudo visualizar relativamente la cantidad de venezolanos que hoy día han migrado a este país, pero a razón del mecanismo implementado, considero que careció de organización, ya que debió basarse en la finalidad de resultados concretos a corto plazo. Para el año 2004, el gobierno de Venezuela realizó un proceso similar.
During this process, we saw the number of Venezuelans that have migrated to this country, but the mechanism for the implementation of the process, I think, lacked some organization because it should have been based, on concrete short-term results, and this may have been absent. In the year 2004, the government of Venezuela carried out a similar process, and this is why I think I can share with you some reflections on the process.
Me permito hacer una serie de consideraciones al respecto, ya que formé parte en la organización y logística del mismo. En este tipo de proceso se debe tomar en cuenta una serie de factores que en términos generales podemos resumir, como lo es la logística, la organización, tecnología y especialmente talento humano.
And so if you'll allow me, I'm going to share with you some thoughts because I was part of the logistics and organization of that exercise that took place in Venezuela in 2004. And this process needs to include a consideration of a series of factors, which we can generally summarize under a series of rubrics: logistics, organization, technology, and human talent or skills.
Es menester considerar que existen diferentes tipos de migrantes en este país, por lo que se debió hacer una serie de selección o preselección, lo que se supone era la revisión de una documentación, o en sus efectos, a través de la base de datos que posee ACNUR, pudo articularse de manera efectiva.
And it's important to keep in mind that there are different types of migrants present in this country, which is why it was necessary to carry out a selection or pre-selection process, including the review of available documentation, or perhaps, as the case may be, the review of the data that was available through the UNHCR's database. And thanks to that, the availability of that data, the process was carried out in a very effective manner.
Hago referencia en esto porque en este proceso hubo muchas fallas, pues no se trata de darle importancia a uno o a otro ciudadano, pero siendo esto una alternativa de Estado para su protección, este proceso pudo ser posible para una regularización de manera que se pudieran otorgar no solo calificando, sino cualificando de forma objetiva.
And I mention this because this process had a lot of shortcomings, but it's not a question of according more importance to one citizen over another, but this is an alternative that the state can apply in order to protect these peoples and to protect itself, because this process itself makes it possible to regularize the status of people in a way that we can classify the migrants objectively.
Tomando en consideración como por ejemplo tiempo de estadía en el país, capacidades personales y así el soporte de algunas referencias para garantizar la seguridad de la ciudadanía, sin menoscabar los derechos humanos y las garantías legales internacionales.
The process can be carried out objectively, taking into account things such as the length of stay in the country, personal and professional capacities and skills, as well as many other points of reference that can be used as evidentiary support to guarantee the safety of the citizenry without violating human rights and international legal guarantees.
Mi experiencia en TRINIDAD como migrante, pese a estar en un estatus profesional no acorde a mí, no ha sido negativa. Desde que llegué al aeropuerto internacional, a pesar de saber que vendría a un país en donde no conocía su lengua, me enfrentaría a muchos factores.
My experience as a migrant in Trinidad, in spite of finding myself in a less than ideal professional circumstance and status, has not been negative. Since I arrived at the airport, I knew I was coming to a country where, not knowing the language, I will inevitably face many factors that could be perturbing.
Mas, sin embargo, la atención en el área de migración fue totalmente diferente a lo que se documentaba en redes sociales o noticias.
Yet, my experience in the immigration sections, the treatment I received was completely different to what was being documented in social networks or the news.
Cada persona que decide emigrar antes estudia posibilidades e indaga. Las noticias no eran nada alentadoras. Sin embargo, emprendí mi viaje con la seguridad que me hace ser una persona de principios, honestidad y profesional.
Of course, every person who decides to migrate researches possibilities and makes inquiries beforehand. The news were not encouraging at all. However, I started on my voyage with a certainty that makes me a person of principles, honesty, and professional ethics.
Después de pasar los controles migratorios, que en mi caso fueron de manera eficiente, no puedo dejar de mencionar que en muchos casos las arbitrariedades están presentes y muchos de ellos se han documentado o hecho virales en noticias, como lo fue el caso de la devolución de 80 personas en un vuelo proveniente de Venezuela.
After going through immigration controls, in my case, they were efficient. And yet, I must mention that in many cases, there is arbitrary treatment. It is present, and many cases have already been documented or gone viral on social media. This was the case when 80 people on a flight from Venezuela returned back.
Pero hay que reflexionar que no solo ha sido este caso, como en muchos. Recuerdo uno muy especial, en donde simplemente devuelven a una persona sin razón ni motivos. No me permitiré cuestionar si había o no motivo tácito, pero según lo que establece la Convención, considero que claramente hubo una violación a los derechos humanos.
There have been, and it's important to reflect on the fact that this case that I mentioned has not been the only instance. There have been many others. I remember specifically one case where a person was simply sent back without providing any reason or explanation. And I one day question whether there was a tacit reason or not, but based on what the convention stipulates, I do believe that there was a clear human rights violation in that instance.
La misma convención establece que hasta que no se activen mecanismos de investigación, la persona no debe ser devuelta. Hago mención a esto porque el vuelo llegó y en menos de 3 horas la persona había sido devuelta a su país. Considero que el tiempo no se ajustaba para hacer ninguna investigación de los motivos por los cuales esa persona quería llegar a este país.
I mention this because based on the convention itself, it states that until the due investigation mechanisms are in place, the person cannot be returned. And I mention this because the flight arrived and in less than 3 hours, the person had already been returned. I don't think the time frame allowed for any investigation into why the person wanted to come to the country.
En este país he encontrado cosas buenas, como también algunas malas. Y es parte de todo proceso, pues la perfección no existe.
In this country, of course, I've encountered both positive and negative things. And that's part of the whole process, since perfection simply doesn't exist.
Su gastronomía no ha sido un desafío para mí. La verdad me gusta tanto como la mía.
The cuisine hasn't presented me with any challenges, and in truth, I like it as much as my own country's.
Es tan agradable caminar y ver a mi gente respetar las reglas, porque lamentablemente, aunque en mi país existe, pero la misma vulnerabilidad política y social ha abierto paso a infringirlas.
It's very encouraging and pleasant to walk around and see my people respecting the rules, because although they do exist in my country, the political and social vulnerability that we experience have themselves opened the doors to their infringement.
Creo que los trinitarios deberían ver ese aspecto positivo en nosotros los venezolanos. Los venezolanos somos personas buenas, trabajadores. No vinimos a quitarle nada a nadie, al contrario. Pienso que estamos contribuyendo positivamente, aportando nuestro esfuerzo y conocimiento. Estoy convencida que de eso se trata, de renovar, surgir en la diversidad de conocimiento e intercambio de experiencia.
I believe Trinidadians should see this positive aspect in us Venezuelans. We Venezuelans, we're good people, we're hardworking, we're not here to take anything away from anyone. On the contrary, I think we're making a positive contribution with our efforts and knowledge. I'm convinced that that's what it's all about. Renewal, rising through adversity, and taking advantage of diversity of knowledge and exchanges.
No puedo dejar de reconocer que también hay personas que no solo viven del esfuerzo y me permito pedir perdón a mi gente, pero ejerzo una profesión la cual me permite discernir entre lo bueno y lo malo. Y sé que también existen personas negativas.
But of course, I must also acknowledge that there are those who do not only make a living from their own efforts, and I must apologize to my people, but the exercise of my profession has allowed me to discern between good and evil. And I know there are negative people.
Sin embargo, no debemos generalizar, solo poder establecer criterios para saber quién sí y quién no. Lo cierto es que a Trinidad me permito decirles, somos gente buena, trabajadora y sobre todo solidarias.
However, I think it's important to avoid generalizations and to instead establish criteria to identify who goes into the yes column and who goes into the no column.
Desde mi perspectiva y convicción, lucho y seguiré luchando como hasta hoy.
The truth is, I dare say to Trinidad, we're good, hardworking, solidary people. We're willing to help and to always offer a smile and a helping hand. And from my perspective and with full conviction, I will fight and will keep on fighting as I have up to now.
La situación migratoria para un profesional a modo de mi experiencia propia, pese de ir en contra de nuestros principios y ética profesional, no obedece sino a una situación que a pesar de encontrarse hoy en día en debate mundial, es un fenómeno y me permitiría llamarlo institución por considerar el tiempo que la migración se ha mantenido en el mundo entero.
The migratory situation for a professional today, based on my own experience, and in spite of the fact that it goes against our principles and professional ethics, is a situation that is today the subject of global debate. And I would say it's more a phenomenon than a situation. I would also even call it an institution, given the length of time that migration has been present in the world as a whole.
Hoy en día me pregunto, o les preguntaría, ¿ha sido posible o será posible erradicarla? Es una pregunta que haría con toda la responsabilidad de no obtener una respuesta, porque pienso que más que un problema de cómo detenerla, debería conllevar a un análisis dinámico de equidad y equilibrio.
And nowadays, I'm asking myself, and I would even ask you, whether it has ever been possible or will it ever be possible to eradicate it. It is a question that I'm posing to you with full responsibility, knowing that there might not be an answer. And why? Because I think that beyond it being an issue of how do we stop it, we should undertake a dynamic analysis based on equity and balance.
Todo esto si se tomara en cuenta la capacidad propulsora de una sociedad orientada hacia el bien común y proyectada hacia el futuro.
All of this taking into account the capacity for advancement of a society that is focused on the common good and the future.
La migración puede ser un recurso más que un obstáculo para el desarrollo del mundo actual. Si adecuáramos la tecnología como mecanismo de regularización, los gobiernos deben considerar y no hacerse a la vista gorda, entendiendo que los migrantes solo buscan mejores condiciones para sus familias. Y en este momento haré una pausa y no generalizaré.
Migration can be a resource more than an obstacle for the development of the world nowadays. But that can only happen if we take advantage of technology as a mechanism to help us regularize the situation of people. Governments need to take this into account, to use this as a resource and not ignore the situation. Understanding that migrants in general are simply looking for better conditions of better quality of life for their families. And I'm going to make a pause here and try to not generalize.
Haré referencia a mi nacionalidad y la razón de hoy en día estar aquí. Bien es cierto que Venezuela hoy día forma parte de un fenómeno mundial al estar posicionada como el país en donde sus habitantes se han visto en la necesidad de emigrar masivamente. Pero no olvidemos que Venezuela fue un país lleno de bondades y siempre tuvo las puertas abiertas para todos.
And I'm going to make a pause here and try to not generalize, because I will make reference to my nationality and the reason that I'm here today. It's true that Venezuela today is part of a global phenomenon, being positioned as a country whose inhabitants have been forced to migrate en masse. But let's not forget that Venezuela has been a country that's full of kindness and always opened its doors to everyone.
Es triste ver hoy a mis paisanos pasar penurias en las fronteras de países que en algún momento obtuvieron y siguen obteniendo beneficios de un país tan generoso.
It's truly sad today for me to see my fellow citizens facing suffering and difficulty and hardship in countries that at some point received and continue to receive benefits from such a generous country.
Hace unos días leí algunos comentarios xenofóbicos. Algo tan simple como un juego deportivo sirvió como desahogo para un bochornoso noticiero.
A few days ago, I read some xenophobic comments related to sport. Something as simple as a sports match served as leeway for a scandalous news bulletin and headlines.
Ellos se referían a mi país como el país más pobre, solo por la derrota entre un juego de Argentina y Venezuela. Me permito aclarar, nuestro país no es el país más pobre del mundo. Venezuela es sumamente rica, pero ahora se encuentra gobernada por políticos que extraen las riquezas de nuestro país y empobrecen a la población.
They were referring to my country as the poorest one, just because of a defeat during a game between Argentina and Venezuela. And I wanted to clarify, ours is not the poorest country in the world. Venezuela is extremely rich, but it is currently being governed by politicians that extract the wealth of our country and impoverish the population.
Aunado a esto, vemos cómo todo va más allá de pérdidas de conciencia, sino de valores, desatando situaciones de violencia, persecuciones de personas que solo van en búsqueda de un trabajo que dignifique su calidad de vida. No obstante a esto, debo considerar como profesional del derecho que este fenómeno permite no solo aspectos positivos, sino también aspectos negativos y contraproducentes.
This goes alongside not just a loss of awareness, but a loss of values, which creates situations of violence and persecution of people who are simply looking for decent work to help them with their quality of life. And in spite of this, as a law professional, I think that this phenomenon allows not just positive aspects, but also negative and counterproductive things.
Una de las causas claras se refiere a la prohibición que ejerce el Estado en donde migras, emprendiendo persecución por parte de las autoridades y por consiguiente deportaciones.
And one of the clearest root causes of this would be prohibitions exercised by the state where one migrates regarding persecution on the part of authorities and subsequent deportations.
Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King y Nelson Mandela, tres hombres unidos por la historia como defensores de los derechos humanos, perseguidos, sufrieron los rigores de la intolerancia, pagando con cárcel y hasta con la vida misma, la defensa de los ideales y los pensamientos libertarios y de igualdad. No hubo mitigación en sus almas y sus rodillas se negaron a la genuflexión ante el poder y la injusticia. Sus pueblos y la humanidad los aplauden y reconocen como íconos de moralidad, ética, amor y tolerancia.
Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Nelson Mandela, three men united by history, recognized as persecuted defenders of human rights. They suffered the rigors of intolerance, they paid with jail time, and even with their very lives. The defense of the ideals and the free thoughts and free thinking and equality never wavered in their souls, and they never knelt before power and injustice. Their people and humanity as a whole recognize them as icons of morality, ethics, love, and tolerance.
Estimados, ¿qué mejor ejemplo e inspiración para cada uno de nosotros que el de estos tres hombres, forjadores de paz y libertad? Algunos de nosotros tenemos la sagrada misión de formar valores desde la universalidad del pensamiento. Otros hemos sido llamados a ejercer funciones públicas. Hago eco en este instante del buen pueblo que anhela mirarse en el espejo de su norma en un Estado de Derecho en el cual este y la separación de poderes sean el norte y fundamento de un verdadero Estado social y democrático.
Esteemed friends, what better example and source of inspiration for each and every one of us than these three men who forged peace and freedom. Some of us have found the sacred mission of fostering values from universal thought. Some others have been called to exercise public functions as public servants. And right now, I would like to echo the hope of a people that wishes to look at themselves in the mirror of their norms and aspirations, living within rule of law, where the separation of powers itself is the foundation of a true social and democratic state.
Mi llamado entonces es a una sociedad activa, participativa y formativa, no pasiva ante esta abrumadora realidad de mi país que carcome un sistema.
I call then for an active, participative society, one that isn't passive before the overwhelming reality of my country, a reality that is making the system collapse from within.
Recordemos aquel humilde carpintero cuyos jueces no escucharon su verdad y por ella y ante los hombres murió clavado en una cruz, cruz que pesó más en sus conciencias que en la misma espalda de Jesús.
Let us all remember that humble carpenter whose judges could not hear his truth. And because of this truth and before men, he died nailed to a cross that was heavier on their consciences than on Jesus' own back.
A los abogados, escogieron la profesión más compleja y aguerrida de la humanidad. Salgamos con la frente en alto, con la mirada puesta en el futuro y su pluma preñada con tinta de honor, para que al escribir páginas de una nueva historia de amor por la justicia, la libertad y la unión de todos.
To you lawyers, you chose a profession that is one of the most complex and difficult in all of humanity. Let us leave here with our heads held high, with our eyes on the future, and with pens full of the ink of honor, so that we can write pages full of a new history, full of a new story, one of love for justice, for liberty, and the unity of all Venezuelans.
No hay caminos para la paz es el camino. Mahatma Gandhi.
There's no roads for peace. Peace is the way. Mahatma Gandhi.
Antes de concluir, me gustaría primeramente agradecer a todos los aquí presentes. Especialmente quiero hacer un agradecimiento a mis hijos por sobrellevar mi ausencia durante más de un año. Entendiendo que cada día deseo tenerlos cerca y muy junto a mí. Mi amor por ellos es infinito. A un familiar cercano, a su familia y a su hija que me ha demostrado mucho amor. A un gran amigo que lleva 16 años como migrante en este país y el cual ha sido de empuje y de ayuda moral.
Before closing, I would like to first of all thank all of you who are present here today, especially my children for putting up with my absence for over a year, understanding that every day I want nothing more than to hold them close to me. My love for you is infinite, and also to my friends and family who have been the greatest comfort and support for me in the most difficult times of my life.
A la señora Aurora y el señor Leslie Fígaro y a su gran familia de la cual me han hecho sentir parte de ellos aquí en Trinidad. A la familia Johnson, infinitas gracias por su consejo y tanto apoyo. A ti, Félix Watson, gracias por la paciencia. Y en especial agradezco a la ACNUR por permitirme hoy día ser portavoz de tan agradable evento. Gracias por ser objetivos y permitirme ser refugiada en este país. A Trinidad y Tobago, gracias por permitirme caminar día a día tus calles. Gracias, Felipe.
To Miss Aurora and Mr. Leslie Figueroa and their wonderful family who have made me feel as part of their own here in Trinidad. To a wonderful friend who, with his experience being in this country for 16 years, has been a great support for me. To the Johnson family, infinite thanks for your advice and support, both to me and my family. Felix Watson, for the patience that you've had. And I would also like particularly to thank UNHCR for allowing me today to be a spokesperson in such a wonderful event. Thank you for allowing me to be a refugee in this country, and to Trinidad and Tobago, thank you for allowing me to walk your streets day in and day out.
Thank you very much, Euclides, for your observations, insights, and experience, and for giving us quite a lot of food for thought this afternoon. And perhaps now is a good juncture to mention that the association has sent out a survey to gauge the interest of our members in basic Spanish classes. So if you haven't already filled out that survey, please do so, so that we can make those arrangements. I must say that we have an audience online of over 130 persons, and I know that some of the questions have already started to come in, but we'll get to the questions later on. Now, I would like to welcome Professor Rosemary Bell Antwine. Before Professor Antwine takes the podium, I just want to introduce her very briefly. Professor Antwine, if you do not know, is the Dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. Her career has embodied a wide and diverse range of scholarly activity, public service, representation, and activism. Professor Antwine has served as an advisor, a team leader, or a sole consultant to almost every single government of the Commonwealth Caribbean and to governments outside of the region, such as the UK, Venezuela, the US, and Canada. And she has sat on several international and regional organizations, including the European Union, OAS, IADB, the World Bank, CARICOM, OECF, UNICEF, ILO, and UNCP. She has also drafted a number of important statutes on diverse areas of law, including on the financial sector, health, public service, education, and child justice. Professor Antwine is an avid gardener, a trained vocal soloist, mainly in classical music, and an amateur artist. And most recently, I know we've been hearing of Dr. Antwine as the chair of the CARICOM Regional Commission on the Decriminalization of Marijuana. Professor Antwine.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. Hi, Priya. Right. Okay. So I'm happy that I came after Euclides. I pronounced it correctly. So we've had a lot has been written, a lot has been said about the rights of migrants, refugees, asylum seekers in Trinidad and Tobago recently. And in fact, on May 8th, we had a historic hearing, University of the West Indies, Faculty of Law, my faculty. We had a hearing before the Inter-American Commission on this subject. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that. In fact, one of my delegation is here, Dr. Priya Kisoon. She just came in. She's not a lawyer. She's a forensic geographer. I could never quite figure out. She says geography, but it's not your normal geography. In any event, and also we had FPAT joining with us. Some of you may know I'm also the president of FPAT, which is actually just a happy coincidence when it comes to this subject, because FPAT is very much involved in this area. So I think you already know the basics of some of the legal issues, because so much has been said. Even our own presentation has been disseminated widely. And what I want to do today is to sort of accentuate the knowledge base, to sensitize you to some of the key issues, but really with a vested interest, which is to try to marshal a cadre of interested and vibrant public-minded attorneys to help promote a better human rights framework for what I think is a vulnerable population in Trinidad and Tobago. So I suspect that's why some of you are here, or most of you. But certainly I think that is what is needed now, to see how best lawyers can serve migrants, refugees, asylum seekers. And in so doing, I think we can help our country go through what is a very challenging period. And I don't envy the state at this time, because it's really a humanitarian crisis in our midst. And incidentally, I don't think this is just about the state. It's also about not just the attorneys, but also ordinary citizens. So I have framed it a conceptual legal framework using international human rights norms, try to project that. And I'm particularly interested in gender issues. I should say I should include gender issues and children's issues. Not just about what the law is, and I think Andrew told you quite a bit of what the law is and what the law is not, but also how the laws that we already have are being implemented. And are they, and the short answer is no, not being implemented either fairly, and that is law and legal policy, or consistently. So it's not just about the law, but how you implement the law. And you already went through some of the differences between migrant, refugee, asylum seeker, but I would suggest that there are some fundamental human rights that should flow through all of them, some basic protections which we get from the international human rights sphere, which should apply to everyone. Perhaps you can put migrant at the lower end of the scale, but even in terms of migrants, all migrants. Certainly, I would say that where there is published legal policy, you want to consider that seriously. And as you heard, we do have published legal policy. We've had it since 2004 in the Refugee Protocol. And yes, we are all aware of the amnesty, the exercise that took place 3 weeks ago. We said in our hearing, it was just before then, that we thought it was a step in the right direction. I've said this many, many times, which permit undocumented Venezuelan and other, I'm told, migrants to work for up to 1 year. Step in the right direction, but I still think it is unclear in its scope and does not go far enough. We are not sure, and I didn't hear Andrew speak about it. I'm not too sure if UNHCR knows, or maybe when Living Water can give us some information. It certainly hasn't been told to the public whether it involved the immediate release of persons who were already detained. We are not clear. Any sort of coherent provisions for due process. And of course, we did all of this in a prevailing climate of xenophobia, uncertainty, and fear, which to us, well, certainly to me, makes it likely that many persons did not come forward because they didn't trust the process. Before this, we were hearing figures of 40,000. We're not too clear, and that was some years ago, and it increased. We know we registered around 15,000, but perhaps it's somewhere in the middle. We don't know, but I am pretty certain not everybody came forward. In fact, I know people who didn't come forward. So what also I think, so it was necessary, it's good, but is it sufficient? And what I think is concerning, especially if you're trying to build a conceptual framework, international human rights sort of framework, is that this process did not proceed along the lines of any human rights obligations by the state. The state didn't say, well, we have these human rights obligations, so we are doing this. It seemed to have been more in the nature of national security, which of course is always relevant, and perhaps some public pressure, which is good, so we're not knocking it. Initially, that was it at any rate. The public was beginning to say, look, something needs to be done. In fact, we recall last year we had a national symposium on refugees, and I think only one person in the whole, and it was a packed audience at the Hall of Justice, only one person seemed to be against, but the tide has certainly swung a bit, but there was an increasing. So it was a response. Also, we are told by the state that those who are not registered will be faced with some hard penalties, so hardline laws and policies if you didn't register. So we have that whole vacuum there. And I think there was almost a little suggestion of some sort of favor being done to migrants. So is it really a favor, or are there concrete obligations? So these issues still pertinent today. Is it far enough? Did it reach everyone it should reach? Because there's still some people who tried to make it, couldn't make it. Is it a rational response today? What happens to others, and you mentioned it too, Andrew, who might still be coming in or who now want to come forward? That's whole vacuum. So I think we still need to look at the state's legal obligations and norms in migrant, refugee, asylum situations. There's an echo which is very, very annoying. Can anything be done? All right. Okay. And I would suggest that human rights violations are still continuing and will continue to occur because of the failure of the state. And when I say state, I am not talking about government. I use state in a very neutral way. So whoever comes in tomorrow or doesn't come in, or and was there in the past, but we didn't go long far enough. It is still the state that takes responsibilities for human rights. So still a lack of adequate, coherent legal policy and administrative framework to really effectively address the huge numbers of migrants, refugee seekers, and so on. And we do know, and I always like to say this, because in 2013, when I first came back, we held a panel discussion, I think it was. At the time, we were talking about Venezuelans. This is probably a bit before, but also about the Africans and so on. So we don't want to forget, I remember Fareed Schoon giving a presentation, etc., and the horrific issues that were cropping up there even then. So instead of formulating a comprehensive humanitarian response, which is based on international human rights standards, what we got 3 weeks ago. And also, at the time when we presented our hearing last month, there was evidence that the state had actually decreased the protection measures that had been in place, such as waivers of security bonds, orders of supervision, which were meant to be alternatives to detention. So you had the diminishing protection as the numbers grew. Yeah. The first, of course, coherent principle in a conceptual framework is that once you've ratified these treaties, you do have an obligation to bring them into effect. So we like to talk about, oh, well, we are dualist states, we just signed a treaty and that's it, nothing, turn our backs, go away. That, of course, is not the case. So the state does have a duty to incorporate, to bring it into effect. So the convention that you heard of, but it's not just about the convention on refugees. It's also about the convention on migrant workers and others that perhaps we did not think about in this context, such as the ILO's convention, which addresses these issues. Migrant workers in particular is a big one. And also CEDAW, on women, and of course the Children's Convention on Children. All those are very, very important to this issue today. And some of the obvious ones, UN Declaration on Human Rights, American Declaration, including the convention which brings into play economic, social, and cultural rights. So there are several that we can talk about. Yes, we understand that there are gaps in the legislation, and certainly there are gaps. There's a paucity of domestic legislation. The courts will, and it's quite well established, and should look to introduce these international human rights norms when it's deciding matters. And it's because of this general principle. You have agreed, you're ratified, and it is a presumption that this is what's going to take in place. So the issue of gaps in legislation, and our Trinidad and Tobago courts have in fact recognized this, and the notion of a legitimate expectation of treaty obligations which is come into effect. And these are no longer abstract ideas, but right up to the level of the Privy Council, we have had these international human rights principles tested. The most important case from my point of view is the case of Naidiki and the Attorney General a few years ago on the binding effect of international human rights norms. But even before Naidiki, and Douglas isn't here today, but we had the Republic Bank case on sexual harassment. We had no law on sexual harassment, quite an old case. And the court looked at the ILO conventions to derive protection against sexual harassment. So it's nothing abstract, strange. These are important tools for attorneys to use if they're going to be interrogating and challenging and trying to get justice for what is definitely a vulnerable group. So Naidiki, in case you haven't heard of it or forgotten it, it was about a UNICEF convention, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the child's father was about to be deported, and the child himself didn't need to be, but the question was right to private life and so on. And the courts, in effect, reframed our Immigration Act I'm sure you have heard about how obsolete, archaic, and against human rights the Immigration Act is, which is the act that we are using to discuss these issues and to look at these issues. And just to read quickly, and I think actually the rights of children will probably be one of the most important issues in this whole migrants, refugee area. And you see why in a minute, but it's also those kinds of rights that most countries, even when they argue about other things, they don't argue about children's rights. Yes, the really high standards in terms of international standards. So in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, quote, it is important, this is Baroness Hale, that the rights and interests of children are taken seriously by all countries which are party to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. It is all too easy to lose sight of these rights and interests, and so on and so on. The convention has not been incorporated into the domestic law of Trinidad and Tobago, this is the Privy Council, although its spirit is reflected in numerous specific laws relating to children. So that's such a helpful case to us. In the end, they couldn't deport the father. And why? Because the general principle, of course, of the binding effect, albeit indirectly, in this case it was quite direct, and the notion of the rights of the child in all actions concerning children, whether undertaken by public or private social welfare institutions, courts of law, administrative authorities, or legislative bodies, the best interests of the child shall be a primary consideration. And that is a universal principle accepted all over the world. All of international human rights have a long jurisprudence on that issue. The court in Naidiki also talked about the legitimate expectations and so on. So you don't have to incorporate. You have the convention, you ratified it. I actually believe even if you hadn't ratified it, the best interest, because the Supreme Court, for instance, in America, just as an aside, like when I was on the Inter-American Commission, the landmark, we were waiting with breath for this, because I'm sure you know, the US is probably the only country in the world that didn't ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child and was still hanging children. You all knew that? Anyway, and within the last 5 years, the Supreme Court, and we all wonder what are they going to do? They indirectly brought these same standards into bear. So now you cannot hang children in the US, not because they went and ratified anything or incorporated anything, but because of this universal notion of the best interest of the child and so forth. So I would say, even if you don't want to ratify anything, this is so important. Right. Now also, I want to remind you of the Myrie case. Again, we all know about Myrie, yeah? What I mean, married the CCJ, but again, it wasn't even a convention. It was resolutions from the heads of government, which Myrie looked at the freedom of movement, CSME arrangement, and said, this is binding, directly binding. CCJ judgment, but I bet you, if that had to go to the Privy Council, same old thing. We have other examples even in national laws like the Jamaica in their labor law framework, Industrial Relations Code, which was supposedly a voluntary code, the court, and this also went to the Privy Council, said, you know, this is the development of norms and so on in labor law. You have to treat this code as though it's binding. So you can't just dismiss anybody unfairly. So the point I'm making, this notion of the spirit of what you're doing and these universal values that are accepted, I think that is very important for us in trying to conceptualize an international human rights framework in order to treat with these cases. I would suggest too that human rights are accepted as being secured within one's territorial borders. So once you are in a territory, fundamental rights should be secured to you. And that's to all persons. You don't have to be a citizen to enjoy human rights. Once you're within there, you're supposed to. So that is why if somebody's trying to kill you, murder you, if you go abroad on holiday, as many of us are about to, and somebody tries to murder you, you can go to the police. Yeah. They're not going to tell you, no, we have no jurisdiction, don't do anything. It's happening within our borders. That's actually what happened. I don't recall the name of the guy, but that fellow that they murdered and implicated Kuwait. You remember his name? I have no idea. The journalist. I mean, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah? Yes, probably. I don't remember names. And it was a Turkish state that blew the whistle. So there's an alien and here, and I'm just saying this notion about fundamental human rights. So this idea that it's just this archaic Immigration Act that should obtain, and we know it has no provisions for asylum seekers, no human rights standards in there. We're trying to derive, UNHCR, Living Water was doing a great job trying to find processes, but you saw how easily, when it was not convenient, that those processes were being undermined because of the fact that these international human rights principles were not really infused into those processes as they should be. This is the same Immigration Act, by the way, that can, if it wished, deny persons with a particular sexual orientation or persons who have disabilities from entry. And this is the same Immigration Act we still have on the book. So just to read you quickly we've had advisory opinion on inter-American system on this, on child migrants, for example, that although states have a margin of discretion when determining their immigration policies, they're obliged to respect the human rights of all persons within their jurisdiction, including migrants. And of course, this is because it's based on fundamental norms of human rights, irrespective of nationality, quote, whether the person is there temporarily or in an irregular migratory situation, unquote. Right, so we should see where we should be putting this convention that we've ratified, as well as the published policy on refugees and asylum seekers, the 2014 one. Okay. Now I heard Andrew saying that we are trained magistrates, you've been training magistrates and judges and so on, that's great. But one of the problems that we talked about in our hearing, because of course we did the research and so on, was the reports that were coming in, and we also got this from the attorneys even way back as last year, were not just the fact that there was a lot of, you're not supposed to say ignorance if you're talking about judges. Lack of awareness in terms of the acceptable. When I'm an academic, I can say anything. You know, the UNHCR, you guys can't. And people like Andrew ought to be well behaved. I don't want to be well behaved. The freedom of being at the university, intellectual freedom. In any event, yes, so we were hearing the horror stories, you know, that some magistrates will give you a nice free pass, others will fine you plenty money, others will throw you in jail. That, I think, in of itself is a violation of fundamental human rights, which requires consistency. Not to mention the legitimate expectation that I mentioned. Also the notion of due process. So you're not even too sure what the process is. Worse than that, we had reports of magistrates saying they don't know what asylum means. This is documented. This is not me saying this. So there was very lack of awareness of what should happen when somebody comes. We all remember the horror stories when this is the Fulma thing that you talked about, where 80 people also were deported and some had their certificates, and there are lots of asylum certificates, lots of stories like that. So uncertainty, disconnect, and incoherence in the administrative and legal judicial systems that confront migrants, and that in itself, I think, is something that should be challenged in terms of, if you're looking at human rights standards and all of these, criminalization instead of a right to asylum, deprivation of liberty. We know that migration generally is not treated as a crime, or should not be treated as a crime, and that should be the last step that you incarcerate persons. Incidentally, I still don't know, and hopefully somebody can answer this question. After this registration process, were the people in detention allowed to register? Do we have the answer, Rasha? A few, that's what I suspected. And we were asking that in the hearing, are they going to be let out of the jails? Because there are thousands of people hundreds. Well, I know when I went to visit the prisons with my class, they said their population swelled from 300, and had one little prison, 300 to 1,000, because of persons who were undocumented migrants. So if you multiply that by how many, it is thousands. Okay, so the authorities saying, they know, they're on the ground, that no, these people weren't let out to go, all those lines you saw. So they're still in the jail somewhere. So that's still happening. access to the courts or review processes, which is another fundamental principle, bound up with due process notions, bound up with the right to a fair trial, accessibility to the courts, even things like language. You see what's happening with the translation, that's supposed to be happening in courts, etc. And should be fair and adequate, not arbitrary. Bail, the way bail is constructed, it depends on family and social ties. Migrants do not have this. Some of them do come here with money, some of them don't, but they may not be able to secure the security bonds. One of the most disturbing bits of information that I received, and this was from since last year, was when the attorneys who are trying to represent people said that they were not being given access to their clients. So can you imagine this is happening in Trinidad and Tobago? Well, I was trying to get access, and I knew I was giving the runaround, because normally they love the dean to come up there, and right away I realized something is going on. I kept writing, and nice little answers, and I realized no, they don't want anybody to see. But I was quite horrified when the attorneys were saying they were able to see their clients, and all of a sudden they were not being, so denying rights to counsel. And the Joint Select Committee, their own parliamentary committee, confirmed this. All right, so this is something which is well documented and confirmed by the Joint Select Committee of the Parliament. I've already mentioned the ad hoc nature of detentions and so on, and all of these issues. And yes, the Boyce case in CCJ also talks about due process and legitimate expectations, at the very least, to a process. Discrimination and xenophobia was something that was very important to our viewing of this whole situation. Clearly, there's increasing xenophobia against Venezuelans. We moved in a very quick space of time from being very happy to have family and friends from Venezuela to being xenophobic. It happened almost overnight. But I would say that this notion of xenophobia and also evidence of profiling, of course, offends the general principle of non-discrimination, which is enshrined in all human rights treaties, what we would call a jus cogens norm, and fundamental rights principles apply, again, whether or not a state has incorporated a treaty. So we see equality and non-discrimination as an umbrella right, umbrella framing right, and it's really a benchmark for the enjoyment of other rights and so on. If you look at the CEDAW, for example, Convention on Rights of Women, clearly what I would suggest that today the state cannot turn its back or turn a blind eye toward what is flagrant discrimination and inequality, including trafficking in women and girls and sexual violence. The most serious forms of sexual violence, which is occurring with high proportions, so disproportionately toward Venezuelan migrants, women and girls. So this paradigm in terms of migration, refugee and so on, I would suggest it exposes significant gender dimensions, which of course accentuate the vulnerabilities of Venezuelan migrants and refugee seekers. We think it is structured, and Venezuelan women in particular stereotyped. Dr. Priya Kissoon described it as hypersexual, the hypersexualization of women, and we're noticing this. So, and some of it documented, you probably should listen to the hearing. I don't have time to go into all of it, but how people are viewing Venezuelan women, the assumptions they make when they see a Venezuelan woman or girl today, again, which has happened very quickly. Yeah, some of the times, in fact, these women and girls are victims of trafficking in persons, but we view them as either prostitutes or loose women with loose morals. And all of that, what I'm saying is that the state cannot turn a blind eye. So at the very least, mechanisms in place confronting the issue to provide protection. The state can, in fact, be held accountable for at least having a system. So if you go to the police and the police refuse to take your case, and so on and so on, these are the kinds of issues that we need to look at. So Dr. Kissoon as well, because this is what a human geographer does, she was able to detail from newspaper accounts how the state could be seen to have encouraged, incited, or simply failed to protect against public examples. So, for example, they made statements like Venezuelans flooding the country and it's a ticking time bomb. So the issue is accountability, responsibility of the state. And in the international arena, we do have a growing body of jurisprudence where states have been held to be accountable for issues like this. They fail to prosecute, for example, race discrimination and so on, especially when there are cases of rape, assault, etc. Rights of the child, I would suggest, as I started with, extremely important. And so the state's obligations to ensure that there are special measures being taken. And why I think it's extremely important, because one, and here's where my other colleague, Donna Da Costa, who's my executive director on FPAT, we have been funded very kindly by UNHCR to actually provide sexual and reproductive health services to Venezuelan migrants. And so we are seeing firsthand the horrific instances of sexual abuse of women and children, many children. We are seeing it. And so she gave a case study, for example, in the hearing. And so this is very important. And when you add that to the already the pronouncements that, you know, children, there's no right to education. They wouldn't be able to get school places. This is what was said even after the amnesty. So that they set up from up front. So the question is, can this rights framework include economic, social, and cultural rights? Because as we know, we talk about civil and political rights, but does the state have a responsibility as well once you accept there's a rights framework? And the short answer is yes. Again, an emerging trend, not just in terms of migrants and so, but generally to look at these issues as more justiciable and enforceable. It used to be as an extension of civil and political rights, i.e. the right to life should be viewed as incorporating the right to a good life. Right to good or adequate life must mean that you have a right to health, that you have a right to education, to work, etc. This is the old jurisprudence of India, but now more frequently is on its own. And we now have indicators, etc. And also if inequality is apparent. So for example, if I give you rights to education, but I don't give you, then there might be a problem. So I would suggest that they are very important indeed. When we add what Naidiki said, especially when it comes to children, you're seeing the kinds of obligations that can probably arise. And of course, the right to health, we have had, it seems a little more on more certain ground, but again, there are contradictions. Because while the Minister of Health, God bless him, has said, yes, everybody should be able to go, all Americans, and have access to health care services, that's not what we're seeing on the ground. And then those who were implementing, they haven't said anything recently, but they were saying it from up front, well, no, you're not entitled to health. So it's a little about a skit. So I would agree with the HIV, but that has nothing to do with this. That is something that was PANCAP was working on. Actually, I was doing the study some years ago, I think about 5-6 years ago, HIV PANCAP, which is the HIV CARICOM body. They had been working independently of this on a framework for HIV. So that is now agreed. So hopefully at least we have that, because that doesn't only flow from international human rights, but it also flows from pragmatic public health concerns. Because if I don't treat you and HIV positive, well, you can see what could happen in your public. So I think that is one to interrogate there. And clearly children, their best interests. We are also seeing, and I'm quoting Donna here, many of the presenting children have not seen a doctor since birth, so they don't have their full complement of required vaccinations. Some already afflicted with non-communicable diseases, etc., etc. And a point that Dr. Kisoon made, which is that when we start thinking about rights to children and so on, bear in mind that some of these children are children of children. So children, and she gave case studies where young girls were trying to access, they were denied entry, went back, came back, and 20% of those who were pregnant, it was documented, were persons who were actually children below, but now we say children are 18, but I'm talking about even the lower standard of children. So very young teenagers who are having children, they were actually being trafficked. So it's really a huge problem. I don't want to be melodramatic, but we do have a lot to solve. And I do think at the end of the day, while states have a margin of appreciation, clearly, national security, all these other things, the point I want to leave you with, we can't turn our heads in the sand and think we have no international human rights obligations, because we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Antwine, for reminding us what our obligations, our human rights obligations are under the international conventions, and comparing and contrasting to the realities on the ground. And it certainly could be quite scary when you think about it in terms of what's actually being realized in this country at present. Right now, we will open the floor for questions. We have we'll take some questions from the room, and we also have some questions online. Is this really up on mic? All right, is that on the mic? Any questions for our panel this afternoon? Or comments? No questions so far? Okay, well, we do have some questions from the online feed. Sorry? No. This question is for Andrew. Andrew, does the UNHCR have any training program for attorneys scheduled for 2019, given the recent upsurge in immigration matters?
Yes, it's something we collaborate with Living Water on. We just had a training in Tobago, and we would like to have one here again in Trinidad. Perhaps we could work through the Law Association to try and have another training on basic refugee protection principles, such as non-refoulement, non-penalization at an international level. Those are the protection principles, but also how to apply domestic laws here and when you make arguments before the court.
We have a question from Sherian Rajkumar. What state subsidies are being given to refugees? I'm not sure if anyone can answer that question or is able to answer that question.
There are really no state subsidies accrued to refugees right now. There's the health policy where foreign nationals can access primary health care. However, to use an example, if there is a Venezuelan woman that gives birth to a child here in Trinidad and Tobago, yes, that child is Trimegonian, but because of the operation of policy, that Venezuelan woman cannot apply and receive state benefits because she is the applicant and you need to be a citizen to receive that state benefit, even if the ultimate beneficiary and for the good is for the child.
Do you have any questions from anyone present?
Andrew, this question is for you. There are many instances where refugee claimants are recognized by the UNHCR, and part of that process doesn't include employment authorization. So you have a large group of people who are waiting their refugee claims to be determined, but they're in this legal limbo where they cannot work legally, and they're subject to discrimination and exploitation by employers. Is there any move at all? Because the minister has the power to grant a minister's permit that permit people to work. Is there any move in that direction?
Very astute observations. When somebody is determined to be a refugee, unfortunately, their rights don't substantially change apart from non-refoulement being crystallized. To speak about Venezuelans in particular, we welcome the government's registration exercise, especially the minister's statement that the two systems are parallel, recognizing that you could be registered and recognized as a refugee under UNHCR registration and register under the government's Venezuelan system and receive the right to work. And right now, that is the only way a Venezuelan, apart from if he has regular status, an employer applying for work permit for him, to get the right to work. There was a lot of collaboration and talk with the Ministry of National Security to afford recognized refugees ministers' permits. However, to move forward on that is really for the Ministry of National Security to determine.
In the United States, which is becoming increasingly anti-migrant and anti-refugee. Even there, if somebody were to, in the past, when you arrive at the airport, you say, I am a refugee claimant. You can immediately apply for a work permit. And that's granted very rapidly. You have access to social services. But in this current political climate in the US, even there, people are entitled to a work permit. If they file a claim and 180 days have elapsed, they can apply for a work permit. Canada permits people after 150 days of a pending application to apply for a work permit. So I don't understand why I'm in Trinidad and Tobago. And what irks me is you have Cuban nationals who clearly are feeling repression, persecution, and all kinds of things, afraid to go back to the country, but they're not given the right to work here.
I can't speak about the regulations and laws in the US and Canada, but you're right, it is an unfortunate system. When I went to law school and I feel some qualification in saying this, the law can be an ass sometimes. And unfortunately, because of the operation of the law here, it does make it difficult for asylum seekers and refugees to get many of the rights under the 1951 convention. Some of them are even in our constitution. For example, non-discrimination applies to persons regardless of origin, the right to life, the right for a parent to choose an educational establishment for their child.
I had,
Mostly a comment more than anything else, and for my colleagues, for the benefit of my colleagues. For example, when our clients are charged for unlawful entry and remaining in the country unlawfully, they would, if they do indeed plead guilty, for example, there are the mitigating factors, of course, when considering. It will indeed be implicating clients in terms of they're not allowed to legally work in Trinidad. And one of the mitigating factors is, what do you do for a living in order to pay this fine? All right, so I think that attorneys should be sensitized to not seek the route of the pleading guilty area, but to look at our international laws, look at our international principles and how it should affect our clients, and have these magistrates understand that there are constitutional rights and there are international principles that are involved in this process. I think people need to also consider the Immigration Act, which also states if someone becomes a detainee, if someone becomes a prisoner, they go into the prohibited class under the Immigration Act. That has severe implications on their refugee or their asylum seeking status. Being someone in a prohibited class, you automatically get into the consideration of being deported, right? So it affects their refugee and their status applications. So as attorneys, people should consider these when considering the implications of a fine and pleading guilty for their clients as well. So more force, our fraternity needs to have more force when they are considering the policies of the government and really enforcing the policies of the government, such as the refugee bill. We need to have our attorneys on the ground to encourage this bill to be passed, and of course to consider it and to hold consultations when it comes to the Refugee Act and, well, eventual act. So yeah.
Thank you for that comment. I would welcome if any attorney present or online has any other analysis or information they would like to share. Because part of the reason why I like to do these discussions is to hear from practitioners on the ground what they are doing.
all right, now in keeping with our theme, migrants and refugees, illegal perspective, we've spoken a lot about immigration, breaches of the Immigration Act, and criminal and quasi-criminal matters. But Andrew, this is something we spoke about today, and a question that I had with a larger migrant population. I'm sure there is also a need for legal services by those migrants. So what are the areas in which the migrant population may require legal services, and what are some of the challenges that they have faced in obtaining legal services in Trinidad and Tobago?
Very good question. The Matters in which asylum seekers and refugees need representation would be if they're detained or if they are arrested and charged. Everybody has the right to have legal representation and is innocent until proven guilty. When they have contentious issues with their landlord, or if they want to get a divorce, sometimes even as basic as writing a will. Some of the challenges that they face are, the main one being language. That is the biggest challenge for being a non-English speaker in Trinidad and Tobago. And there are different ways to get around that. There are applications that attorneys could use. One of them is called Tarjimly, Tarjimly. It's a free interpretation service. It's up to you if you want to use it. It's not certified interpreters, but perhaps you could use it to take instructions, but you will need an interpreter, a certified interpreter if you're going to court. Other challenges might be getting documentation that the individual mightn't have with them, particularly if in the unlikely event that you need 2 forms of identification. Many asylum seekers and refugees might only have one, which is their passport that immigration may or may not have, or they may not have their passport to begin with because they would have left in a regular way, not having the ability to obtain a passport.
We have a question online from Roland Bain. The question is, am I correct in concluding that the decision to detain and or deport the parent of a Trinidad-born child can be challenged based on the best interests of the child? If yes, I anticipate that such a challenge is made via judicial review application to the High Courts.
Yes, it has been.
It's on.
Yeah, it has been denied. That's what the NIDK case was about 7 years ago. So the answer is yes.
Janelle Farrell has said, excellent presentation from Professor Antoine, extremely informative. Her comment is with regard to the inclusion of international human rights laws to court matters, the need for interpretation and guidance. Clearly, there is a need for coherence in the rendering of judgment, verdicts, and penalties from the magistrates and the judiciary. And of course, this is something Professor Antoine has spoken about, the issue of inconsistent sentencing, which many of us continue to observe from court to court. Kyle Jackman has asked, what is the approximate percentage of non-Venezuelan granted refugee status by the UNHCR in Trinidad and Tobago?
In terms of numbers for the caseload, about approximately 90% of asylum seekers and refugees registered with us are Venezuelan. I would invite you to do some further research. Unfortunately, I don't have the statistic off the top of my head, but you can go to a website that we have. You could search for UNHCR POPSTATS, POPSTATS. It's a very dynamic website where you could see trends and disaggregated data. For example, you could see the number of Syrian men that applied for refugee status in 2016, if that increased or decreased to 2018. So I would encourage you to go there instead of getting an approximate number from me if you're looking for a nuanced number, specific number.
Okay. We have a very tongue-in-cheek comment from James Chankit. How can you enforce a refugee's right to good health care when the citizens of this country are not afforded good health care? Well, I suppose that's a rhetorical question.
I would say start by enforcing citizens' rights to health care. That might be your first step. Similarly, in terms of education, clearly no citizen should be displaced because you keep hearing horror stories of children who not being able to get to school. I mean, those things should be challenged in courts. And I want to reiterate, Elena, is it? You know what she's saying, because I started my presentation by saying that what I already see in terms of attorneys, apart from just going on there on your own, is ready to build this cadre of professionals, legal professionals who can press the issues, not just in courts, in imaginative ways, as I've tried to outline, but also advocacy, just plain old advocacy. And I think that is what Frederick and they are trying to do here, I imagine. Yeah, so because we can't continue the Immigration Act being the authoritative source for this issue, we won't get anywhere. It really is backward. So we do have an obligation. And I also think, incidentally, that if lawyers and so on speak out about these issues, it could do something about the xenophobia that is developing. I think it might be a sane voice.
I could add on the healthcare comment, part of the UN's work in the country is to leave nobody behind, and that means citizens, migrants, refugees. And we're here to support the government, but as well as communities to improve the infrastructure for everybody here. So there are challenges in accessing education, even for nationals, but we can assist the government and communities improve infrastructure for the benefit of all persons.
Can I just ask you, and I just have a question for you. I also feel that part of what should be done, and why I mentioned that lots of people is not just the state has obligations, but the state can have public-private partnerships in education, which I think Living Water is already doing. But if a state cannot, because these things are costly, cannot build X more schools or put people on shift or what have you, it can help organize some sort of system with public-private so that children can be educated, etc. These are things that can be done.
It really takes a whole society approach to deal with refugees and migrants in any country.
All right. One final question.
Thank you. Yeah, so my question is more in the commercial context of the registration process, particularly the fact that the uncertainty of when it expires. Because I can see a potential problem for employers, particularly as the time runs down, as to why they may be reluctant to recruit a Venezuelan, given that in a few months' time, their new employee, their status becomes quite uncertain. So I don't know if there's anything you can say to reassure employers about recruiting Venezuelans, because it seems to me it's pointless having a work permit if no one's willing to employ you because of the uncertainty.
Anybody needs to respond to that?
That's a commercial consideration that the business would have to undertake. And it really, as the Minister of National Security himself said, the government will continue to assess the situation as it gets towards the 12-month deadline. And they may very well put out another work permit exemption, but it is in the discretion of the government what happens next. And we're here as the UN to assist it, as I'm sure many attorneys and community groups are recognizing a whole society approach.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So as we wrap up this evening, we've heard some recurring themes throughout the afternoon. We heard a lot about the treaty obligations, the international obligations, and refugee law from all our presenters this afternoon. And it's clear that the association will have to do some further training in collaboration with the UNHCR and also the faculty in bringing our membership on current with the international treaty obligations and our refugee laws. We've heard a lot about a culture of xenophobia and fear as a recurring theme this afternoon as well. And of course, we as advocates do have the power to change that narrative within our societies. Clearly, there is a need for legal services for our refugees and migrants in Trinidad and Tobago, and we can all do our parts. It's unfortunate that the Honorable Minister could not attend this afternoon, but one of the things that I see is that there is always a need for more consultation. I think Please's presentation this afternoon showed the vast nature of her experience and how that consultation could benefit the states in implementing any policies. And of course, we have the UNHCR, we have the academic community, but we as attorneys, we are also an important stakeholder in that process, and we need to recognize our role in that the drafting of legislation, the review of legislation, and also in any policy that the government plans to implement. So thanks to everyone for attending today's seminar and for making today's seminar possible. Firstly, to our speakers, Professor Rosemary Bell-Antwine, for taking the time out of a busy schedule to enlighten us on our international obligations. Thank you very much to Mr. Andrew Welsh and the staff of the UNHCR Port of Spain office for their support of this initiative. Thank you to Ms. Yeclis Del Jesus Carrion, me and you for your very honest and thought-provoking account as a refugee and as a lawyer in Trinidad and Tobago, and to Daniela for her translation as well. Thank you to everyone at the Secretariat who made this afternoon's presentation possible. We want to thank our convener of the Continuing Legal Education Committee, Mr. Frederick Street, and the entire committee for ensuring that we have a program. Thank you to our executive officer and the support staff here at the Law Association for making all the arrangements, to you and to you, the members of our physical and online community. Thank you for tuning in and your attendance, and we have some refreshments outside. Thanks very much for coming.